My name is Mary Beth Vander, and I'm president of the Vander Group. Today's presentation addresses what COVID-19 relief funding says about grants monitoring in education and how we as monitors can conform our practices to what the law says. But first, I'd like to give a brief introduction. The Vander Group is a Chicago-based firm providing turnkey grants monitoring programs to organizations, and we specialize in grant programs that serve vulnerable populations. Since our founding in 2003, we have overseen grants monitoring in 24 states, and our presenter today is from the Carolinas. The Vander Group grew out of my personal experience in authoring the roadmap for the reform of the Chicago Public Schools in 1995 and as president of the Illinois Association of Inspector Generals. That was many years ago, but in the last 18 years, our firm has done a lot of work across the country. When we start these presentations, I like to first begin with just a reminder of why we're here and what we do. I often tell the story of when my mother, who just passed away a couple of years ago, a very good friend of mine, she used to tell the story about her childhood growing up in Chicago, and it was in the 1940s. And her science teacher was really, really excited about the new microscopes that were going to arrive. And they waited and they waited and they waited, and the teacher couldn't stop talking about them. Well, they never came. And they never came because they were stolen. and I always go back to that story because it fuels me. It's my inspirational story. It tells me why we do what we do every day. Now we have a situation where nearly $280 billion is being poured into education, which is a great thing, right? But we, as monitors, have a sacred trust to make sure that money gets to where it needs to go and is used for what it needs to be. Well, why else do we monitor? We monitor because, of course, we have to. It's the law, right? Governmental entities, whether federal agencies, states, cities, or school systems, distributing federal money are required by the Uniform Guidance and other legislation to monitor. But monitoring serves a number of other roles. It really improves stakeholder morale because it gives people an understanding that that we care. We as government, I'm not in government anymore, but I was for many years, and we serve government now. But those who are in government or emissaries of government agencies, it shows that we care. We care about program integrity. We care about effectiveness. It also builds trust with stakeholders outside of the system. Stakeholders may be funders in some cases, taxpayers, certainly parents, students. And then our monitoring allows us to tailor technical assistance to the needs of the program. And in the gaps that we identify during our visits, our site visits, or our desk reviews, show us where technical assistance needs to be developed. And finally, monitoring, among other things, it improves internal business processes in the grantees that we serve, in the school districts that we serve. And this reduces the likelihood of microscopes disappearing in the future. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jillian Helding, who is our moderator today, and the Vander Group manager of outreach. Jillian?
Mary Beth, thank you so much. Thank you for being here, everyone. Before we get going, I just want to share a few housekeeping items. So during the presentation, please remember to keep your microphones on mute. We are going to have a pause briefly between sections of the presentations to do questions, and there will be a full Q&A at the end of the presentation. If at any time you have questions, there should be a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen that you can type them into. Do make sure that you're using the Q&A box and not the chat box. Joining us for the Q&A will be our Director of Fiscal Monitoring, Greg Macris. Greg has managed or provided fiscal monitoring services for more than 15 years and served for more than 20 years as an auditor in the public and private sectors. He has extensive experience monitoring federal and state grants with the Vander Group, Chicago Public Schools, and the Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority. He's deeply versed in federal education law and internal controls, and he's experienced in conducting quality control, training, shadowing, and mentoring of monitors. Just two more technical notes. If your Zoom window is too small or you're having difficulty seeing the presentation, you can use your mouse to grab the two white bars at the edge of the panelist's video screen and drag it to the right, and that'll increase your screen size. If at any point you're having technical difficulties with Zoom, you can either send me a private message in the chat window, or you can give me a call. I'll be putting my phone number in the chat as well, and that is 508-308-1878. Now I'm going to turn the meeting over to our presenter, Gina Merrell. Gina is a member of the fiscal monitoring team at the Vander Group, and she joined us with over 20 years of experience in grants monitoring and compliance for government, nonprofits, and educational institutions. She's passionate about helping other people understand federal regulations and bureaucracy so that we can better serve our grantees and their communities. Gina, take it away.
Thank you so much, Jillian, and thank you everybody for joining us today. So we're going to talk about what CARES, CRRSA, and ARPA, the acronyms for our COVID-19 relief funding, say about grants monitoring for our K-12 education. I want to give you an overview of our agenda, some of the areas that we're going to cover today, including the allowable use of funds, the reporting and record keeping, and the monitoring requirements. But I want to start with just a brief overview of the COVID-19 relief funds. There is a lot of information out there, and there's a lot of money. As Mary Beth said, there's almost $280 billion that has been put into the COVID-19 relief with the 3 legislative bills that have passed. And there's a lot of rules and regulations that accompany all of that, along with the requirements to track everything. So the 3 basic ones, CARES, which was passed in March of 2020, CRRSA, which was passed and signed into law in December of 2020, and the most recent ARPA, which was passed and signed into law in March of 2021. The overarching view I really want to say is the CARES Act really created the framework for the Education Stabilization Fund. The CARES Act laid out what the allowable uses are for the funds. It laid out this expansive framework that CRRSA and ARPA have come in and funded with some more dollars and expanded the use of the funds for the education stabilization. We'll get into the 3 pots of money, but I'm sure most of you know the money in the Education Stabilization Fund has been divided into 3 areas. The ESSER, which is the Elementary and Secondary School Fund, the GEER, which is the Governor's Education Emergency Relief Fund, and the HERE, which is the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund. So let's first talk about CARES, the framework that all of this has come about. The bill was passed in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Obviously, our lives turned upside down last year, and this was the government's way of putting some more money to ensure that schooling continued in whatever format that it happened. It's the first time in history that we've had to really change how we've provided education to our students. The biggest thing about CARES, when I talk about the framework, this is the framework, the overarching rules governing the authorized use of these funds. The first and most important one is that they have to be necessary expenditures due to the public health emergency of COVID-19. That is a broad concept, and we'll get more into the detail when we talk about allowable uses. The second one is that these expenses cannot be accounted for in the budget prior to March 27th of 2020. And essentially, when that bill was passed, they wanted to make sure that the funds weren't being used for anything that had been budgeted previously, but for any new expenses that happened due to COVID-19. And of course, the original period was March 1st, 2020 through December 31st, 2020. A lot of that has changed. The federal government has decided that the tidings amendment should apply to these funds, and we'll get into the new due dates in a few slides. So the thing about the CARES, and unlike a lot of legislation where everything is really built out, there is a lot of autonomy for the states and the Department of Education and the states to talk about how these CARES funds get regulated. And I know that if you were to take a look at the different states, you would see that each of them has implemented them a little bit differently. As long as that framework is held, that is the most important thing related to where we go from there. So let's talk about the three funds created out of the education stabilization. The Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund, or ESSER, as I'll refer to it during the majority of this presentation. The Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, or GEER. Oh, I'm sorry. Our presentation just stopped. Hold on one second. When we talk about the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund, that is for the higher education institutes within a school, within a state. Jillian, I'm sorry, are you able to pull up the presentation?
Yes, just 1 second.
Okay. I'm sorry about that, folks. These are all those technical difficulties dealing with Zoom.
You know, Gina, while we're pulling up the other presentation, what do you think are some of the common myths about CARES Act funding?
I think probably the most common myth is that this is, because it was done in such a quick manner, which, as we all know, does not normally happen with federal funding, that these funds needed to be spent and spent quickly without the foundation and the infrastructure behind it. I know personally, I've been involved with the CARES Act on the school side, making sure that we try and spend it. And one of the common things that I had to say to our school personnel and our district personnel was, yes, I know we need to get this spent quickly, and I know that but we need to do it the right way. And we need to do it within the framework of federal funding, because that is what this is, federal funding. So I think my slide has come up again. So I apologize that for everybody, but I think that has been one of the biggest challenges is some institutions, some agencies think this is a free-for-all, and it's not. And a lot of them don't, some of them don't have experience with federal funds. And so they don't understand everything that comes along with the moment that you bring a federal dollar into your agency, into your school district, into your state educational agency. A lot of red tape comes along with that. So let me get back to the ESSER funds. This is fun. These funds are meant to fund local educational agencies throughout the state to address the impact of COVID-19. The Governor's Emergency Education Fund is to be used at the discretion of every state governor, and it can be used to fund K-12 schools and higher education institutes that have been significantly impacted by COVID-19, but at the discretion of the governor and the governor's office. And then the higher education is to provide financial support and resources to higher education institutes and enrolled students who have been impacted by COVID-19. So let's talk a little bit more. We talked about CARES. Let's talk about the Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act. It was signed into law on December 27th, and it really increased funding to the Education Stabilization Fund and other federal agencies. The other thing that it did is it did expand the allowable cost under the second ESSER program. And I really want to point out the word second ESSER, because one of the things that does, even though all of these dollars are geared towards the same purpose, every single one of them must be tracked separately. So with 3 legislative bills, we have funding for the Education Stabilization Fund, however, funded for ESSER 1, ESSER 2, and ESSER 3. And the American Rescue Plan Act that was signed into law on March 11th. For this one, the purpose of it was not only to provide additional funding for the education, the ESF, as I'm going to say, but really designed to ensure that schools reopen as quickly and safely as possible. And they put a few more provisions where CARES and CRRSA had appropriations for the ESF and then subsequently ESSER and GEER and HERE. In this legislative bill, they were more specific in that the funding should not only go to ESF, but also to fund evidence-based interventions for learning loss and evidence-based summer enrichment and after-school programs. So before we move on, Jillian, do we have any questions in the Q&A box for this section?
So far, the only one was about myths regarding the CARES Act, and I think you've covered that pretty well, so we're good to go on.
Okay, perfect. So one of the best summaries that I found has actually come from the CARES Act itself. And I have taken this on a mantra whenever I'm speaking to anybody about the CARES Act and what it is, what it does, and what we can use, what we can implement with the use of the funds. And this is not only for CARES, but for all of the COVID-19 relief funding. But prevent the spread of COVID-19, prepare for COVID-19 and its impact on students, teachers, and schools, and respond to COVID-19. I think one of the hardest things that we've all had to deal with is the fact that education has not stopped. I know as a mother of 5, my children are in school every single day, and they have been since the pandemic hit. But you have everything that goes along with running a school, along with these funds that have come in and trying to do these new 3 separate things that have honestly taken over the majority of our lives. So let's talk about ESSER. This is the CARES Act governs the allowable costs covered under ESSER. And it was the first bill, and it was the most defined bill as to what costs were allowed and what weren't. And I just want to go back to talking about those overarching rules, because this is where they really come into play when we talk about allowable costs under CARES. It has to be a necessary expenditure related to public health, to the COVID-19 public health emergency, not accounted for the budget, and incurred during the period. One of the things I know for anyone who's ever worked with federal grants, we're not allowed to go back to claim expenses that happened prior to being awarded those grants or prior to the normal opening time, the federal fiscal year or the state fiscal year. But this one we did, even though the bill wasn't passed until March 27th, it allowed schools to go back all the way to March 1st, and still are able to go back to March 1st of 2020 to charge these grants for allowable expenditures. And with the tidings period amendment that's been applied, that the Department of Education has agreed to apply, ESSER 1 is the allowable expenses are until September 30th of 2022. ESSER 2, September 30th, 2023, and now ARPA, September 30th, 2024. So one of the big ones about allowable costs is that fact that you have any activity authorized under the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965 that you can pay for. But I wanted to give you an example because I know this is probably one of the more confusing provisions, because this is what governs all of our federal grants, whether it's Title I or IDA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So the example I like to give is under IDA, you can purchase, depending on a child's IEP, you can purchase a sorting activity or a name activity or anything that is, furthers the advancement of their goals under their IEP. That's allowable under IDA. It would not be allowable under IDA, under the CARES Act, unless it had something to do with COVID. 2 of the best examples I could tell you is preparing a remote learning kit for the children who are still at home or who were at home for the remainder of last school year and maybe the beginning of this school year. Those children still need those equipment to help succeed in their goals of their IEP. So preparing a remote learning kit for them to be able to have those items at home so that when they're doing remote learning with their teachers, they would actually physically be able to do the work. Or if you have students that are still in class, in reality, we no longer can share items in the schools, in the classrooms. So instead of one sorting item, or instead of one set of paints or one set of notebooks, we're going to have to buy multiple sets. That would also be allowed under the CARES Act because it has to do with COVID-19. If COVID-19 pandemic had never hit, that student would be in school being able to get the same instruction that they had been under normal IDA regulations and school regulations. But because of COVID-19, they're either at home or we have to make sanitation and cleaning and non-shareable items available to our students to protect them. The next allowable cost is the coordination and preparedness and response effort. And this is really making sure that any of your school districts can use the funds to help coordinate with their public health department or their mental health department or any other agency that they may need to deal with their situation as it relates to COVID-19. We know that all across the country, there are areas that are hotspots, there are areas that are doing much better, but this allows us to be able to have our schools prepare for the worst and prepare for being able to continue the education of our students, even if governors decide to change the rules and some areas might go on lockdown or they might be released. This is an ability to help fund that coordination so that they can prepare for anything that may happen again in the future. This is another broad definition for allowable costs to address the needs of their individual schools, providing the school leaders with the necessary resources. And again, when I've spoken to schools and when I've spoken to our agencies, when we talk about this, it still has to be under that overarching framework. It has to be related to COVID-19. It cannot be something that's already been budgeted, and it has to be between the March 1st and the end dates of the various ESSER and GEAR funds. But there is a lot of flexibility in this, and that's where especially state agencies, Department of Educations, have to be able to define themselves what they would determine as allowable under this provision. The outreach and service delivery to address the unique needs of low-income children, children with disabilities, English learners, racial and ethnic minorities, students experiencing homelessness, and foster care youth. We all know that this pandemic has hit everybody hard, but not harder for the populations that are the most vulnerable, whether it's children who have lost the structure or families that have lost the ability to work because their children are at home, or their own what is happening in their neighborhood, or the family, people who have lost relatives and loved ones to COVID. This allowable expense will allow us to help those most vulnerable populations, again, with a lot of flexibility, how the states determine their local educational agencies can apply this to their community. This is another one that has a lot of flexibility to it, but to improve the preparedness and response of the local education agencies. Nobody was prepared for what happened last March. I know I was in a school system and I was not prepared. None of our school leaders were prepared for this. But in reality, we have to understand that this is it. Hopefully it will not be our new normal, but this pandemic is nowhere near being over with, and we don't know what's going to happen in the future. So making sure that we have plans in place to be able to handle this or handle anything else that comes to it. I think the last year has shown that our kids and our schools are quite resilient, and we need to be able to capture that and expand upon it to handle whatever comes at us in the next year or two. The training and professional development of staff, especially around sanitation and minimizing the spread of infectious disease, not just COVID, but obviously this is one of probably the biggest pandemic we have had dealt with in the recent future. But we all know that this is not, we hope it could be the only one that we have to deal with in our lifetime. But in reality, we have to prepare to make sure that we're protected and our schools and our students are protected. Purchase supplies for sanitation. I have no doubt that everybody has seen at least one purchase of gloves and masks and everything else that we never thought that we would have to purchase for our schools. But these funds can be used to purchase those supplies specifically to help prevent the spread of COVID-19 in your schools. And then again, these funds can be used to help plan and coordinate during long-term school closures. I know from my experience in our schools, one of the biggest worries that we had was that a lot of our vulnerable kids counted on the meals that they were provided at school for breakfast and lunch to get through the day. So how are we going to make sure that they had food, especially with everything else going on, the worry about the pandemic, parents losing their jobs, people losing their homes. So this is something that we really need that would be good for schools to be able to focus on, to plan for the future, meals for eligible students, online learning, making sure that we still have to carry on the requirements of IDA, and then make sure that all of the other federal, state, and local requirements are followed. Because although I know we had a breather for the first year at the end of 2020, we all know that the federal government has not waived the requirements for this year. So how are your schools going to prepare for that? And how are they going to make sure that that all gets implemented with everything else going on? One of the biggest purchases that I'm sure you have all seen, and that is probably the biggest one to track, is the purchase of hardware, software, and technology. I know for myself, when I was involved in implementing the CARES grant in our school, we purchased a ton of computers for students. I am talking, if we had 900 students in our school, we purchased 850 computers. With this being federal money, all of the requirements are there, tracking that item, making sure that it's being used for the purpose that it was funded for. 850 computers at one time was a lot, and that was a small charter school. You can imagine what your districts are facing with the amount of technology and software that they've purchased. But this is one of the allowable costs, and in my experience has been where a majority of the funding has gone for a lot of districts. Providing mental health services and supports, making sure that we address the needs of the kids, of the students and the teachers to handle everything that's been going on this past year. And then making sure that we use the fund. Another allowable use is to ensure that we plan and implement education after school and during the summer. As I mentioned, this is one of the it's an allowable cost under ESSER. With the CRRSA legislative bill, it really didn't talk specifics about this one, but with ARPA, the bill that was just filed and signed on March of 2021, there is a certain amount of money that schools must set aside. They actually have to set aside 1% of their ESSER 3 funds to focus on evidence-based interventions for learning loss. 1% for evidence-based interventions for their summer learning programs, summer enrichment programs, and 1% of their ESSER 3 costs for after-school programs. All have to be evidence-based. So that kind of adds another little component to the monitoring requirements, because now not only are we having to track the funds, but you also, with the new funds under ESSER 3 and the American Rescue Plan Act, now we have to make sure that the percentages went correctly to the learning loss, evidence-based interventions for learning loss, evidence-based interventions for summer enrichment, and evidence-based interventions for after-school programs. And then another broad one, that other necessary activities to continue providing educational services. And on one hand, I know that most school leaders probably adore the fact that we have some flexibility in the federal funding that we've been given. But I think it's important to realize that we still have to make sure that whatever is funded under this allowable cost follows that overarching framework of the CARES Act and follows the rules designated under the ESSER 2 and ESSER 3 pots of money. So let's talk about the CRRSA, the Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act. This, like I said, has increased funding to the ESF. The one thing I really want to talk about is that what it did is it not only, the CARES Act allowable costs that I just went through are still applicable, but they added 3 more areas in December of 2020 that they wanted these funds to focus on: preventing learning loss for students, preparing for reopening of the schools, and probably one of the most important ones is testing, repairing, and upgrading the HVAC systems to improve air quality in school buildings. I think probably anyone who's involved in education funding know that it's very rare for federal dollars to come down to provide for capital improvements. But this is in direct response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and probably one of the bigger costs that are going to be incurred by schools, and probably one of the most necessary ones. But this can only be funded under the CRRSA Act, which is ESSER 2. So schools, districts will have to track to make sure that those expenses, which can be backdated to March 1st of 2020, are only funded under the ESSER 2 funds and not ESSER 1. Then the American Rescue Plan Act, the ARPA, put another $130 billion into the Education Stabilization Fund. But this one, like I've said before, 20% of that funding, 20% of the funding that local education agencies get have to go towards programs to counteract learning loss by students with evidence-based interventions. So again, another thing that needs to be monitored to not only make sure that it's 20% of their funding goes to the learning loss programs, but that they are evidence-based interventions. There was also funding focused on mental health, more funding for higher education. This is the pot of money that was separated out. Instead of putting money, additional money towards the GEAR program, the Governor's Emergency Education Relief, 2.75 billion was put for non-public schools to be able to implement changes and fund to prepare, respond, and prevent the COVID-19. And there was also additional funding for the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act as well. So with that, Jillian, are there any questions?
Yeah. So Lori asked, can ESSER funds be used to build a new school?
So the best response I have heard is if that school, well, let me say, I would highly doubt that it would be able to be used to build an entire school. However, if the case can be made that that is needed to prepare, respond, or prevent COVID-19, my suggestion would be for any kind of district to talk to the state educational agency, because they're going to be the ones that really have the final say. The federal government has provided the guidance, but it's the state educational agencies that are going to have the say for that. I would say it would probably be very hard to make a case that an entire school needs to be built to prepare and respond and prevent the spread of COVID-19.
Well, and for those on the line who are from the state agencies, obviously that's a question to put to the Department of Education. When we have some lack of clarity, we talk to the department, and they're very helpful in explaining some of that, but they'll be the final funders. There's a lot of complexity in these laws, and there's some room for interpretation. So yeah, in that case, we'd say go to the program officer.
Any other questions, Jillian?
Nope, we are good to proceed.
Okay. So let's talk about the reporting requirements. And most of you know, and I know a lot of folks are here from the state, so I won't go into detail about the reporting requirements. I will say that I'm sure some people were probably disappointed that the Department of Education decided that, CARES Act actually says that the state educational agency receiving more than $150,000 must report on the use of these funds on a quarterly basis. Every single state received more than $150,000. Luckily, the Department of Education decided that the requirement could be met through the existing reporting mechanisms. And this applies to CRRSA as well as ARPA. So with providing monthly reports, to me, what I have seen is the biggest problem is that because there is so much money being sent out, and for a wide variety of uses, that a lot of your districts, a lot of your schools may not be used to reporting on a monthly basis, especially down to the details if they're purchasing Wi-Fi hotspots or if they're purchasing classroom video technology. So this has been probably one of the hardest things for schools to understand and schools to implement, and also for state agencies to be able to monitor. They do use the subaward reporting system, and the information needs to be put under for the subcontracts, depending on the value of those contracts. but it is at the discretion of the state how they want to get that information from their districts back to the state to report to the federal government. So let's talk a little bit about the uniform guidance and grants monitoring. So I'm sure anyone who's involved with federal grants on this call understand that the Uniform Administrative Requirements and the Cost Principles, Title II of the CFR Part 200. These funds, CARES, CRRSA, and ARPA, are all subject to the federal uniform guidance. The required monitoring components that we have to do, and this is for pretty much all federal funds, including these, has to be risk-based, depending on on-site reviews. A lot of people are doing desk reviews right now because travel is still not recommended. Verification of programmatic and fiscal reports, performance-based verification of audits, and the incorporation of training and technical assistance. I think I've said it before, and I really can't reiterate this enough. I believe one of the biggest problems that we've had with these CARES funds is that a lot of money has come quickly. It has come quickly to a lot of agencies that may or may not have a lot of experience with federal dollars. And unfortunately, at the end of the day, you're talking about $280 billion in a year, in addition to all of the other federal and state and local funds that schools get. That is a lot of money to put into these agencies, into this, whether it's the state agencies and then their subrecipients, that has to be monitored, that has to be tracked, that has to have an overview of it, in addition to everything else that's going on in the school systems. And the subrecipient part is probably the biggest thing, because the state educational agencies, because the uniform guidance is applied, has to monitor each subrecipient for these funds, for its programs, its functions and activities, and the performance expectations that the state agency has put on their local education agencies. So we talk a little bit about the subrecipient monitoring, and I think one of the things that I know I'm waiting for, and I check the Department of Education website on a regular basis to try and get as much information about these COVID-19 relief funds as I can. I think that we're waiting to get to that point when all of this comes to the forefront, and we've been spending this money, and we've been getting out there and buying software for the students for online learning, purchasing the technology, purchasing the items. The accountability piece of it is going to become the bigger part of it. Once we get all this money spent, is how are we going to make sure that we hold everybody accountable? I believe the federal government's going to ask that of the states, and the states are going to have to ask that of their local education agencies. So being able to look at it now before this time period is done and have a program in place to be able to do that, to monitor the activities of this subrecipient and be able to make sure that they're in full compliance with the federal statutes, regulations, and terms of the award. And one of the things that we want to do is really look at the subrecipient's risk of non-compliance. There are a lot of, like I said, agencies, school districts that may not have received this kind of federal money before, may not have received any federal money before. And as anyone will tell you, the moment you accept that $1, you have to play by every rule that the federal government sets up. So being able to take a look at your subrecipient and find out which ones are most at risk for non-compliance, which one, if there's any new personnel or substantially changed systems, in addition to everything else going on with the school, navigating the pandemic, navigating online learning with in-person learning, keeping the schools safe. That is a lot of things to juggle at your districts, and being able to help guide that and formulate a plan that will make sure that each state is in compliance with what the federal government wants, and that each subrecipient is doing what the state needs is an important thing to remember. One of the things I do want to say is that the regulations, and this is in general about the uniform guidance and especially about the COVID-19 relief funding, is that there is flexibility in how you monitor your grants. and how you develop their monitoring tools. Obviously, the uniform guidance is what is guiding us all, but being able to come in and figure out how you're going to go about doing that is at the discretion of the states. So I want to focus on 3 areas of the uniform guidance that I have seen as probably throughout my entire monitoring and grant management career, the biggest problems. The subrecipient internal controls, the monitoring for use of funds, and then the Single Audit Act for the entities that receive over $750,000 in federal funds. So I won't go through these slides one by one because I'm sure a lot of you already understand what the process, what internal control is. But I think when we talk about in terms of these funds, and again, it goes back to what I said was one of the biggest challenges is this is a lot of money thrown at schools. And with an urgency, when the CARES Act was first passed, it was passed March 27th with an initial date to spend by December 30th of 2020. So we're talking months to spend a lot of money and an urgency to find how are we going to get kids their educational needs. How are we going to get them fed? How are we going to keep our staff from quitting? How are we going to keep it safe? A lot of it was designed to get the money out, get the money spent for those purposes. Oftentimes, the internal controls may or may not have been overlooked. And at the moment, in that moment, the idea was to get the money spent and to get it spent quickly. Now that we have extensions and the money does not have to be spent until the first deadline is 2022, we need to go back and look at these internal controls. Do your districts, do your schools have the internal controls, the policies and procedures needed to make sure that they're compliant with the uniform guidance? And then also with the best practices to make sure that we achieve the objectives for the federal awards. I'll give you just a moment to look that over. And I think it's important that we take a look at this. A lot of your districts are already going to have this. They already have their internal controls because they probably receive either Title I or IDA or Carl Perkins technical CTE funds. But there are going to be a lot more agencies and district and schools that don't have those because they may not have chosen to ever take federal funds before. So I just want to go through some examples of the internal control compliance documents. I'm going to talk about a few of them in detail. I think the time and effort certification policy procedure is a big one. And let me tell you why. If you look at most schools, most of your districts, a lot of them, they're using their Title I funds, and the majority of their time, their staff are 100% devoted to Title I or IDA, probably the 2 biggest federal grants that fund staff personnel. So they're required to do a certification every 6 months saying that they spend 100% of their time. Well, now it's very rare to actually find an employee or a staff person who's dedicating their entire time, 100% of their time to anything under CARES or CRRSA or ARPA. But you do have teachers and administrative personnel that are dedicating a portion of their time to the activities under these COVID-19 relief funds. They will need to do time and effort. That's probably something that a lot of them have not done. A lot of school teachers, actual school teacher personnel who may be teaching a certain grade are now helping to develop remote online learning curriculum. That could be funded under the CARES Act, but if it's only 10% of their time, they now need to do a time and effort sheet, which also means that the state agencies need to monitor that and to make sure that we have a time and effort certification policy procedure and that we have correct tracking activities for that purpose. The equipment and real property management. And I want to talk a little bit about the procurement policy and procedure. And this goes back to what I talked about before. This has been a lot of money sent to schools, sent to states, and then sent on to their LEAs. And in a short amount of time, they needed to get that out. Well, one of the things that we really need to monitor is in that craziness, the first 6 months of the pandemic, let's say that, or the first 8 months of the pandemic in 2020, did we follow the procurement policy? If we had something that was over, if your procurement policy says that anything over $1,000 needs to be, have 3 quotes to it, do we have those 3 quotes? It's the usual standard that we have to follow as monitors, but with this amount of money and the urgency of it, it could possibly bring a new, a lot more questions and a lot more concerns about whether or not it was actually followed or not because of the circumstances. Same fiscal management and purchasing procedures, and then the inventory procedures. And I want to go back to my example of purchasing 850 computers. Any of the technology and hardware that's been purchased with these federal dollars has to be under the inventory procedure. So have your schools, have your districts made sure that each of these items has been inventoried and is being tracked to be sure that it's being used for its designated purpose. The cost allocation plan and the record retention management, those are 2 general ones that most, like I said, most of your schools and districts probably have it, but need to be in place. So I'm going to go through and give some examples and review documents required for monitoring expectations, staffing costs, supply purchases, equipment, and contracts. So one of the examples, I want to give an example of an LEA has decided that each school has to designate a 4th grade teacher to take on additional responsibility of developing a remote learning curriculum for the solar system lesson planning. The LEA expects these additional duties to take about 10 hours a week above and beyond their normal teaching duties. So of course I highlighted that to make sure that because it's above and beyond, then this is more than likely going to be under stipends. And the LEA is going to seek reimbursement for those additional 10 hours paid through the ESSER 1 awarded funds. So what policies would be required to be in compliance with this? What documents would the LEA need to be provided for a monitoring visit? And I will tell you, I have spent my educational portion of my monitor career here in North Carolina and South Carolina. So we have requirements that you have to have a staff stipend policy that talks about, and honestly, it is really a best practice, in my opinion, should be implemented nationwide. But a staff stipend policy is to make sure that you are able to identify the staff person that you're going to give the stipend to, that there's an agreement between the school and the staff person about what additional duties are going to be funded with it, and then signed by both parties to make sure that there is an agreement as to what that stipend is going to pay for. Early in my career, I worked in county government, and one of our attorneys made a statement that stayed with me. If something is not in the 4 corners of a white sheet of paper, as in it's not in a contract written down, then it doesn't exist. So I would always recommend that any district or any school make sure that they have a policy for stipends. But you need that executed stipend agreement, the copy of the pay stubs, the document. And then the other thing is the budget tracking. Because again, and we talked about this before, although this is all under COVID-19 relief fund, although it's all under a general sense of allowable cost, each of these bills that has been passed has created a separate funding source that has to be tracked. You have to track how much ESSER 1 funds you got and how much your agencies, your subrecipients spent on ESSER 1 and how much they spent on ESSER 2 and how much they spent on ESSER 3, with the caveat that ESSER 3 has some other requirements about the 20% towards learning loss and the 1% towards summer enrichment programs and the 1% towards after school enrichment programs. So here's another one, the LEA, and I'll let you take a look at this. This is more so, the example I wanted to bring with this is more so about a staff person within their normal working hours taking on additional duties. The school administration asking him or her to take on additional duties. And this is where, again, what policies would be required and what documents would the LEA need to provide for a monitoring visit. This is where you're going to need your time and effort certification policy. And this is probably where my biggest concern is as it relates to your subrecipients. Again, Title I, IDA, a lot of those are 100% devoted. We're not going to have, more than likely, you're not going to have 100% dedicated to these COVID-19 relief funds. So we're going to have personnel that are not used to doing time and effort certifications, doing this on a regular basis in order for your grantees to be able to seek reimbursement under these funds. And again, we have to track it to make sure that we're spending it under the correct ESSER funds and that we're tracking it against the budget of those ESSER funds, ESSER 1 or 2 funds. Here's the example that I used before about purchasing items for a student to attend school via remote learning. To ensure that the school purchases a puzzle, body part, toy, and sorting game for the student whose IEP contains goals and objectives that can only be accomplished with these items. Again, what policies, what documents would the LEA need to provide? This is where you're going to have have your fiscal management and purchasing procedures and your procurement policy. Although most items that you would probably purchase under IDA are not going to meet any kind of threshold that your agency, your subrecipient would have. What happens if you have a sensory room and you have 5 students with IEPs that need to be in that sensory room? They're not going to share trampolines anymore. They're not going to share any of the sensory balls. So now you need to purchase 5 trampolines, or you need to purchase 5 sensory items or swings, occupational therapy swings. This is where, again, things were purchased quickly. Things were purchased to get it in to help the students, but we still needed, the subrecipients still need to have these policies and procedures in place and follow them. And depending on that, we'd have to look at the number of quotes required, a copy of the invoice, copy of an executed, this is a new one that I think for those items sent home, you need to have a copy of an executed agreement showing the loan of items to the student and or the student families, because these are items purchased with federal dollars. We can't just give them to students and not have an expectation that they would be returned back. It says that the same thing with technology. We need to be able to track that technology so that the school gets it back, because those are federal tax dollars that have gone to pay for this and sent to private homes. And the last thing I wanted to touch on was the Single Audit Act. I'm sure all of you are very aware of it. The thing with the Single Audit Act is that if you take a look at a majority of your schools, a lot of them never got over the $750,000 threshold for federal funds with their their entitlement grants, Title I, Title II, Title IV, Title III, or their IDA. But now with these CARES funds, there is a good majority of your subrecipients that will now go over this threshold of receiving $750,000 in federal funds, and they are now subject to the Single Audit Act. So they need to comply with it, and you need to make sure that they do comply with it. And that could be overwhelming. Again, with everything else going on, this is one more thing that your subrecipients now have to deal with and have to make sure that they're in compliance with.
Gina, as I understand it, I do have one point I want to make. Uniform guidance, 100% of it doesn't apply to these funds. You touched on the parts that do apply to these funds. Is that correct?
Right. Well, the uniform guidance with a lot of them, there are a lot of states have different rules that they've come in. The 3 that I've touched on are probably the biggest, but we want to make sure that everyone is complying with all of the uniform guidance, especially if they receive other federal funds.
Oh, certainly for other federal funds.
Yeah.
Okay. Jillian, I was going to suggest that because we have so little time that I would just wrap it up after you ask would you like me to speak first and then I'll turn it over for questions, or would you like to go into questions now?
Let me just get at least one question in now that we had come up during this section, and then we can see if there's anything more at the end. It says, do you recommend monitoring of all ESSER pots simultaneously or separate monitoring for ESSER 1, 2, and 3?
I would recommend that you monitor them together. And that is, it's a lot of work. It is going to be overwhelming. It is going to be because you have to be able to separate them out. But in essence, your subrecipient has to separate them out altogether. I would say that you want to make sure that your subrecipients have the mechanisms in place to track these separately. I do believe that because we have a year between each of them, that you can go out and actually do desk reviews separately. So let me re-say that. The mechanism for tracking should be monitored altogether. You want to make sure that they have that in place right now, because these funds are coming, they are here, they are being sent down. I know the states are working right now to figure out, the ARPA funds and how do we get those out and the guidance that they're going to give the schools. But I think when you actually do the desk reviews, you can start with ESSER 1 and Gear 1 and then work your way on from there. But the mechanism for tracking and recording that has to be, you should monitor now to make sure they have that in place.